Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Mysteries and Oddities video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do yet another new entry here. This one based again on one of your new suggestions. I'm probably going to wrap up this series soon. I would have normally done so a couple of videos back, but there's just been so many great suggestions this go around that I just had to keep this going. Such is the case here with this fascinating epidemic that occurred apparently back in the 1960s, and it actually linked to a video, I thought at least, that I did a couple of years back that I'll mention here in a minute. It just goes to show that when there's this type of craze or other type of mania that just takes over a small population, makes you scratch your head, makes you wonder just how these things begin, let alone spread, almost like a viral stance of some sort. But yeah, when I was reading this information here, even others to this day are still mystified as to how this particular epidemic occurred. And what I'm talking about is this. It pretty much only has one single term, but it's known as the Tanganyika Laughter Epidemic. Tough word to say, Tanganyika and then Laughter Epidemic. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating information associated with this very, very bizarre phenomenon. First, I wanted to mention the video that I was referring to that I did a couple of years back. I'll include the link for it below. It was actually what was called the medieval dance mania, which was some phenomenon that occurred back around either the 14th, maybe up to the 17th century in Europe. And the reason why it reminded me of it is because it too involved all of a sudden a small population of people doing some kind of hysteric thing all at once, or growing in some cases from a small amount of people to a larger group of people, and no one knows how it happened. So check out that link if you haven't had a chance to see the video, and then that way you'll get to see essentially how it links to this one here. But yes, this Tanganyika laughter epidemic, this occurred back in 1962, specifically January 30th, at a location of a village near a village called Kashasha. I hope I'm saying that correctly too. But yes, that's where this particular area occurred. Today, I believe it's known more on the lines of Tanzania. So at that time period, January 30th, 1962, that seems to be the origin point. All of a sudden, there was a boarding school there that was mission run, but it was pretty much all for girls. And all of a sudden, these three girls just started laughing. And when they started laughing, they just continued laughing. And then it grew to some of the other girls surrounding that school or that classroom, and then eventually spread throughout the entire school itself. In fact, out of about 160 students that were there, around 95 of them were impacted. Can you imagine that? Like pretty much 2/3 of the population there, and there were ages from 12 to 18. They just started laughing uncontrollably, and it almost seems like it wasn't a bad thing at first. But imagine that. Imagine if you're laughing for just a little bit, maybe giggling here and there, but then the longer you continue, as was the case here in some parts of, or in some areas of these schools, they lasted in just not just a few hours, but even up to 16 days. Oh my goodness, that blew my mind whenever I read that info. Imagine that, 16 days of just full on laughter, uncontrollable, absolutely no way to stop type laughter. That's what was happening to these girls' population that were there. Interestingly enough, none of the teachers, none of the other staff were affected by this. It just pretty much only impacted the girls that were there within that boarding school. So much so, in fact, that the actual school ended up closing early, like on March 18th, because of everything that was happening there. If you thought it ended there, in fact, it continued elsewhere. Somehow, some way, this epidemic, whatever it was, not only went from that village, but it skipped to another one. There was another village nearby that was named Nshamba, and then that's where several of the girls there started it as well, and then it just grew from there. It impacted, again, a good majority of the population there, and then this time it went to some of the other villagers there. It spread for the next few months, and there was about 217 villagers in total that were having these crazy laughing attacks. I mean, it was just amazing to read this, because you wonder, like, how does this happen? How does that work? Can't people just stop when it comes to this laughing? But as it turns out, it just continued growing and growing. And in fact, with that previous school, the one that closed earlier, that I mentioned earlier in March, that one ended up reopening just a couple months later in May. And then guess what? It closed again in June because of everything that was happening yet again. There was a strong indication of this epidemic once again holding a grip throughout that entire area. And then when that happened, this things continued to spread, whatever this craziness was. And then even that, it even skipped to yet another school, place nearby an area called Bukoba, and it impacted almost 50 girls there as well. So as you can see, it grew from 3 girls all the way to an area there for the school, all the way to the village, all the way to another village, all the way back to the school, and then in turn went to yet another village altogether, and then that was it. It just continued as is. And then it got so worrying because of this. As it turns out, some of the girls there, after their encounters, like in other words, after their laughing epidemics, they in turn were followed by restlessness. Apparently, there was a bunch of aimless running being done by those children. And in some cases, it even led to the occasional violence there. So that's where things took more of a darker turn. It didn't just start with just laughing. It ended with laughing. No, things definitely took a more serious turn. And in other cases, that involved serious cases of crying too. So imagine having something along those lines as well. Imagine being able to just not being able to stop because you're just crying uncontrollably and laughing somewhere in between all those hours or maybe even up to days of this crazy epidemic. And then just as quickly as it started, it seemed to just stop. All of a sudden, after those couple of months, it was gone. And then when that occurred, there was some ramifications of it afterwards. The school there that I mentioned earlier in Kashasha was sued by some of the parents. They actually thought that the school could have done a better job in stopping it, transmitting it to other areas, in other words. And then everything else happened. If you wanted to try to time it from beginning to the end, when the very final case, if you call it that, of this laughter epidemic stopped, it was around 18 months later. That's when the very final one occurred. And if you wanted to even go even further and find out what the true outreach was, you're looking at about 14 schools in total that ended up being shut down. So I was just talking about 2 of them, but now we have 3 of them, but now we have 14 schools that were actually shut down throughout this epidemic, and then up to a total of 1,000 people. Amazing stuff. 1,000 people were impacted by it as well. And then if you wanted to go into other weird situations on there, apparently there was even cases of fainting and even flatulence, that's right, farting, that was involved too, and then other forms of respiratory problems and so on. So this thing definitely stood out. Somehow it started again in the 60s, 1962, and then it went for about 18 months, and then that was it. So if you wanted to find out what caused it, maybe there was a scientific standpoint that could figure things out, there's this. It's been theorized that this is nothing in terms of, let's say, some weird phenomenon. It's actually an illness of sorts. It's known as psychogenic illness or psychogenic disease. And pretty much what that is this. Your body, whenever it's going into a huge amount of stress, whether it's even the body or even something else involving the mind in of itself, your body tends to react to it even as much as you try to stop it from happening, in terms of, let's say, keeping things calm, keeping things in order. You just want things to go away. Your body's going to go a whole different route. And this psychogenic disease or psychogenic illness causes uncontrolled things to happen. Some of those involve tics. Other involve things along the lines of noises that people make, like in other words, whistling or other things that they do. But in these cases, it can actually involve laughter or even other things involving crying, like I was mentioning earlier, or even marks that start appearing, like physical marks, within the body itself. I was reading some of this information, and again, it's just so fascinating to realize that the body in of itself can do a lot of things inadvertently or purposefully whenever you're trying to ensure that you're trying to control it. In other words, no, it definitely almost has a mind of its own, and it'll release things whenever you're in a very stressful situation. In fact, the people that are researching this phenomenon and then trying to figure out what happened, that's what they were stating occurred there at that location that I was mentioning earlier near the village of Kashasa. Apparently this area there was just experiencing some newfound independence or freedom, and so people there were pretty much stressed about the situation, about what occurred, and apparently they were also under some kind of British rule at the time. In fact, that boarding school was being run by some of the British people there. So there was this idea that all that rules, all those stresses that were coming upon them, and then the fear that was induced from it, all of a sudden it was just causing these laughing fits to occur. And because of it, that's where it started spreading into an epidemic of sorts. So at least that's one theory associated with it. But who knows if that's the case or if there was something else out there. But otherwise, it's very amazing stuff. In fact, the idea again that something like that could happen, especially under high stress, uncontrolled emotions of some sort. I mean, you see that in movies all the time. Like, it reminded me, for example, of the movie Baskin. Remember at the very end, that guy that went through that entire gauntlet of just pure horror. Whenever he's finally at his end and he's running around and escaping that hell house, whenever he does so, he starts laughing almost uncontrollably. And that again seems to be a response from the body to the mind and vice versa of releasing things, especially if they go through just craziness of some sort. But if anyone has any more information, anything else I might have missed, then please post those comments below. What about anyone there that happens to be a local, maybe someone that knows more information from that standpoint? Then please, I would love to hear what your thoughts are on there too. All right, everyone. Thanks again as always. Take care.